Hey everyone, welcome to the Anexinet, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 42, recorded April 15th, 2019. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet. Here on the Anexinet, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we are going to be talking about being more than just an IT insurance policy with Eric Doherty, Technical Partner Manager from Veeam. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the topic at hand, why don't you first tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background in the field?
Sure. So I've been in the IT world for, call it over 25 years now, which now you can guess just how old I am. I try to look more youthful than I actually am. But
see, I would have never guessed 25 years.
That's the truth, though. It's depressing when you think back on it, but it's great too, because you take all that experience. While the technologies you didn't deal with, you dealt with 20 years ago, don't really matter anymore. The concepts still apply, so it's still valuable to have all that experience. Over the past decade or so, I've had my own small IT consulting company, worked for Microsoft, worked for a regional cloud provider, worked for a large global backup provider, and have now established roots at Veeam.
Okay. So far you like it?
I love it there, honestly.
That's great. That's great to hear when you find like a good fit for you culturally. It's like, yes, I'm in a good spot.
It's a good group of people.
Awesome. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was the fact that most of the time when people think of backup and recovery, they think of it really as like an insurance policy. My backup software is my insurance agent against accidents, whether it's someone accidentally deleted a file off of a file share, or if a database got corrupted, or, ransomware hit my file drop and I need to recover all that data. It's really like an insurance policy, but no one really likes to pay for insurance, do they?
They don't like to pay for insurance, and they hope they never have to use it, which is really the way the backup has been viewed probably since its inception until the real recent future.
Yeah, I mean, that puts it in a weird spot because you're asking people to pay for something that they hope they'll never use. So if they have to deal with your interface on a regular basis, it probably means something went wrong.
Or you have some people that really shouldn't be in the positions that they're in.
Valid point. So I guess, how do you design software that makes it, someone who's in a panicked sort of situation, put them at ease and make them know that they'll be able to get that data back?
Well, that's a great question, because I think the first place that you have to begin with that is to make an interface that feels familiar. And obviously, if you're a Windows, even if you're a graphical Linux user at this point, an Explorer-type window is something that everybody's comfortable with and knows how to operate within. And that's what Veeam's backup restoration process is based on, is our Explorers. And we have specific Explorers for Exchange, Active Directory, SQL, regular file browsing, storage arrays.
Sure.
So now you could be restoring from a storage array and know nothing about how to operate that storage array, but still be able to comfortably browse into it and get the files out that you need.
Right. Yeah. I mean, simplicity is key, especially in a crisis situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and it may not always be the backup operator that you're used to that deals with that on the day in and day out basis that's trying to help with those restores in a crisis. It's usually usually the worst things seem to happen. When they're on vacation, out of the country, inaccessible. That's usually when the worst crises happen.
Yeah,
people you need the most aren't around.
Away on some
it's Murphy's Law.
Soul-searching sojourn across the desert.
Top of a mountain, middle of the desert.
Those backup
servers are crashing left and right.
Yeah. So, I mean, table stakes for any backup and recovery software is to be able to back up and, more importantly, recover.
Yeah. Absolutely.
If you can't recover, then the backup doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. So, I mean, obviously you want that to be the baseline.
It is the baseline. And the thing to keep in mind also with those backups is you need to be able to know that the backups are going to be reliable, that when that problem happens, you're going to be able to get the data out of them that you need to. So while table stakes are just backup and restore, I think if you increase those table stakes just a little bit, it's verified backup and restore.
Right. Yeah.
And not necessarily something that everybody's thinking of when they're evaluating products or when they're actually in the process of doing that backup and restore work.
Right.
Until it doesn't work.
And then you're really in a tizzy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's our backup insurance, right? And most people would view that as a cost to the business. There's no value being added, unless you do have a catastrophe. But just generally speaking, there's no value being added by insurance, really. It's insurance.
Exactly.
You got to have it.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think most vendors want to also provide value to a business. So how could you start creating value from backup and recovery software?
Well, there's some great things that Veeam has been doing, and it's kind of funny because the one feature of Veeam backup and replication that a lot of folks don't deal with is our data labs, which used to be called virtual labs.
Virtual labs, okay.
It's been around for several versions now.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the best kept secrets, I call it, in the suite because it's not something everybody applies. But when you use it, you have the ability to stand up that backup data and use it in an isolated environment to run other tasks on. So you could pull up a database and run search queries against the non-production databases, test that data, do some data validation tests against it. You could bring up to do OS patch testing against it. You could do software patch testing. Your dev team could test their new versions of software against these restored VMs while in an isolated environment, all within Veeam. So it doesn't even require an additional environment, doesn't require additional hardware or software beyond what you already have built, and it doesn't have any impact on your production from a compute or performance way.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So, you've pulled in all this data, all these virtual machine images or databases or whatever it is that you're backing up, and now you have the ability to restore them into some sort of bubble environment,
Yes.
which will let you, first of all, like you're saying before, validate that your backups are actually good. Could you recover?
Exactly. And we call that, just to give the marketing name for it, it's Sure Backup and Sure Replica. So if you're doing backup or replication. So that's something that can just be added as a feature into your backup jobs. So it's as simple as that, but you have to have the data labs installed and configured first.
And then in addition, if you wanted to take a production environment and try out a new patch or a new version of software, so you need to clone that production environment, you could use the backup software to do that.
Correct.
Now, one issue that I know I've run into when trying to create a QA or a testing or a dev environment is, well, there's two things. One, it's never on parity with prod because you're usually trying to keep them all in lockstep. And that never works out. So this sort of sounds like it solves that a little bit.
It is, and it's not necessarily in lockstep because you're pulling it. It's not going to be if record is written to production, same record getting written to this because it is an isolated backup environment. But it does give you the full environment as of a moment in time.
Right.
So take last night's backup, put it into that bubble environment, and you can even have access to it through. We do some address translation.
Okay.
So that you don't have to worry about re-IPing everything within that bubble, and you can grant specific access to specific workstations or whatever, so that you don't have duplicates of all your systems online at the same time.
Yeah, that could be bad.
That's pretty bad. Yes.
But the other thing that I've come into, and I don't know if you're addressing this today, but sometimes the production information that's in a database can't be cloned into a dev environment because it has sensitive data or information.
Yes.
So you'd want to mask some of that information in some way. Is that something that like data labs could do, or is that
absolutely?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the answer up till earlier this year would have been no, or you'd have to do some different manipulation. But we've come out with a new feature called Staged Restore.
Okay.
So with Staged Restore, you have the ability to, during that restore process, bring it into that lab, manipulate the data, and pull out data that you don't want. So maybe you don't want to have that customer-sensitive information, but you want to have the layout of the database.
Right, yeah.
So you could strip out the data and then continue to keep that in the data labs then so that you can work with that database without the secure, sensitive data.
All right, so I'm going to get a little crazy here.
Okay.
Is it possible to script this restore process so that you could make it part of a development pipeline?
Absolutely.
You win.
That's
You
the cool
win.
thing.
That's all I want.
Well, that's the great thing. Well, it doesn't everybody. One of the big things with our Update 4 that came out this year is it seems like just about anything you can think of can be scripted with PowerShell. So now you can start to make your restore scripts, and then your DBAs probably already have some sort of scripts that they're calling anyway to strip data out as they're doing things. Or at the very least, they can help you build the ones you need so that you're getting the right data removed before using it in the environment.
Right. Yeah, I've definitely heard of a process before where people would basically refresh dev from prod every night, but it was usually a pretty cumbersome process and required some manual intervention. So if that's something you can like fully automate, you just made someone's day.
And it's yes, and that's the great thing about it is there's also the process you described. Now you're hitting that environment twice because it does have to be backed up, and that replication, it's going to have a performance hit. And if you have a highly available system where you don't really have a performance downtime acceptability, then you're going to have an issue in there where while that's being replicated, there's going to be a performance degradation.
Right.
During the backups, depending on what methods you use, there could be a performance degradation. You can't keep having these performance degradations just to get an offline copy to manipulate of this data to work with in the background.
Right. So it's sort of a 2-for-1. You get the backup and you can stage the data into your dev environment.
And the beauty of it is once you do that, if you work with that data, you don't like what happened, you just delete it and you restore it and run the process again.
All the time you're leaving prod alone. Like
prod's
out
just
of it.
chugging along, doing what it needs to do.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So that's one way to drive value with backup and recovery. Another thing that I think of is like when all the information that backups are capturing, it's basically, the self-selected important stuff about an organization. I mean, if it's an important thing, you're probably going to back it up. So you've selected that really important information. And now you're basically sitting on a giant repository of stuff that has been deemed super important. And I feel like that information might be ripe for analytics.
I would agree with you. And I would agree that while you probably can't necessarily run deep analytics from inside data labs, you could certainly use those backups to then move those workloads or that data into, say, an Azure AWS environment, where now you're able to use their analytics tools against that data.
Okay.
And that data, from there you could move it into, it could be just into their virtual machines. It could be into object storage, wherever you need to work from it from. You could move it into there from the backups. There just comes a point where you need more horsepower than what something that's a, quote, lab environment is able to provide. You need to go to full production. And the cloud is ripe for that because it's pay for what you use. You're not buying huge boxes that sit idle 6 hours a night.
Right. And I imagine so when data is being backed up, generally you're indexing it. Especially if you're doing dedupe on it, you need to index it to reduce and compress.
Well, even to be able to do the file restore. So that's different. You're also indexing within so that you can go find individual files within a VM so that you're not having to mount and search a VM every time that you need to do an individual file restore.
Right. So with that level of awareness of all the information and sort of an index of all that information, has anyone started using that to glean insights about patterns of use or potential malware or, if you see something that is uncommon or outside of standard deviation, you can sort of latch on and be like, ooh, I think something weird's going on here.
I haven't seen that yet, but I like the idea, and I'm hoping that somebody who listens to this takes that idea a step further because that's kind of cool. But what we do have the ability to do when you mention malware and ransomware, there's another feature within Data Labs that's newer that I think is huge, and that's called our Secure Restore. What happens is you have these backups going back however long your company has to keep them, months, years, whatever the case may be. So I backed it up 6 months ago. 5 months ago, I discovered there was some ransomware. We got hit by a ransomware attack. And however we got through it, company gets through it. So now I need to get data off of a backup for another project from 6, 7, 8 months ago, knowing that there was this attack in the middle there. Under normal circumstances, I'm going to be very hesitant using any of these backup files anymore because I don't know when that ransomware actually appeared.
Right.
Typical time is 140 days or so of when there's an actual breach to when it's actually discovered. So that's 3 months, it's 4 months. Geez, it's a lot of time.
Yeah.
More than you want to spend with data potentially at risk, and you definitely don't want to reintroduce that into production unassuming and unawares.
Yeah, that's what we call a resume generating event.
Exactly. Yeah, you do that while you're putting your jacket on heading out the door.
Yeah.
So what we have the ability to do now is the same as we can kind of, in the middle of during staged restore, run those scripts to be able to pull out specific data. We can run antivirus scans against the data that's being restored.
Okay.
So as we're pulling back a VM, it mounts in an isolated environment, scans it, and gives you some choices of what to do. If everything comes back clean, it goes back to production. If it gets flagged for any sort of an issue, it can be brought back and brought online with all of its network adapters disabled.
Okay.
Or you can just abort altogether and say, nope, you're not getting your data. I don't want to risk it.
Right.
So there's a group that's definitely going to do that. But it was interesting because I was talking to somebody, and I hadn't really thought of it this way. And it just happened that there was a security expert from a company sitting in the room with us when we were talking about this feature. And they said, wait, so when you bring that on with no NICs, could I then just add an adapter that connects it into my forensics network? And then I can take my deep forensics tools and start analyzing this known infected box safely? Sure, there's no reason you couldn't do it. So suddenly they were very excited about backups. And when's the last time you saw a security person excited about backups?
I'm going to go with never.
That's probably a good guess.
Yeah, that's not usually what gets them all.
So now
attention.
they have evidence that they can work with of attacks when they
Right.
find it like this. So if they know something's there, they can safely bring it back online in their environment and really look at it with the tools that they have. So that generated some excitement in people that don't normally get excited.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I want to shift the conversation a little bit because you mentioned the capability of restoring some of this data to Azure AWS to do analysis. And I think if there's one technology that has transformed the landscape, it's been cloud, right?
Absolutely. Whatever that word means to you, it absolutely has transformed
Absolutely. Everything's cloudy. But when I think of how cloud might impact data management, I think of two things. The first is using cloud as a target for your backups, maybe a tiering sort of operation, something like that. But the second is backing up all the stuff that exists in the cloud. So why don't we talk about the former first? What's the opportunity for using cloud as a target for backups, and how are you sort of approaching that opportunity?
Well, there's a lot of ways that we're using the cloud, and I think we're very lucky in the relationships that we have with storage vendors, because that's always been one of our first entry points into cloud, is the ability of the storage vendors. Now, there are some that are a little more reluctant to use the cloud as a part of their storage plan than others.
Okay.
But there are several out there that are adopting cloud as an additional tier within their on-prem physical storage.
I gotcha.
So, with those abilities to back up to their on-prem storage as a target, then we can use their technology to move things out to the cloud. So
Right.
that's one step that can be taken. More recently, we have the ability to use object storage as a secondary target, meaning we can move long-term archive out to the cloud to object storage, more specifically, cheaper storage.
Right.
You don't want to necessarily long-term store on block storage because that's expensive.
Right.
And also, when you're dealing with cloud, you have to remember that I've heard it called, the Hotel California or quicksand. You can check out any time you want, but you can never leave.
Right.
Or in quicksand, it's easy to get in, it's hard to get out. It's always they charge you on the way out. I also kind of got in trouble with some folks in New Jersey because I said it's like New Jersey and bridges. You can get into New Jersey for free, but they charge you to get out.
You always pay to get out.
Yeah, everybody will pay to get out. They didn't like that, but hey, now they know.
But
it's
it's
from
true.
PA. It is true, and so they couldn't really argue it. So you have to keep that in mind too when you use it as a storage medium. Is think of it as long term. You're not going to touch that stuff because it's going to cost you when you start accessing it on a regular basis.
Right.
It's a good tape alternative. Just the same as when you store your tapes off-site, it costs you money every time a truck rolls to deliver you a tape. You're not going to put yesterday's backups on the truck and then have to call them back 2-3 times in a week every time somebody needs something. You're going to keep a few weeks, a month worth of your data on your local storage still.
Right.
And then maybe you'll have a copy in a secondary data center. You want to be able to have fast access to it for quick restores that don't cost you a lot of money.
Right.
And then in addition, you want to make sure you have it off-site. So that's our old-fashioned 3-2-1 rules. You want to make sure you have the one copy off-site. 3 copies of the data, 2 different medium, 1 off-site.
That sounds right.
It's about right. I think sometimes it's 2 different locations too, but that would make it 1 off-site. But that's the most important thing to remember is that 1 off-site, and it's always been tape. I'm pretty convinced at this point tape's never going to die, especially the fact that they have LTO specs written out for like the next century already.
Aren't they up to like LTO 9 or something?
I think they are, and the next version's going to be, I forget how many tens of terabytes on a tape.
Right.
Which is not that different of a tape than the one that we were using 10 years ago.
They just managed to pack more bits on it.
I don't know how. I'm not a tape expert, but I'm fascinated by the fact they can do it.
Yeah. And tape is cheap.
Tape is cheap, and it's the ultimate air gap.
True.
When you think about it, again, going back to the security folks who want to know that there's a gap. When you get to ransomware, you need to know that if ransomware hits, it's not going to hit your backups, because how are you going to recover from this other than hoping that the dishonest guys who attacked your network are going to be honest enough to help you clean it up? If you want to put your faith in that, go ahead, but I want to know that I have some secure backup somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate air gap. Now, cloud is great for that too, because if you're writing to object storage, that's a different protocol than the Windows protocols that are normally attacked. Mm-hmm. So you have an artificial air gap that's just as good almost.
Right.
And probably if you sit down and talk about it with your security team and say that this is an air gap because you're changing protocols, they'll probably give you I think that'll work.
You can get behind that, yeah. They might not be as excited about tape.
Not yet.
As tape.
Either that or, they're the ones that love to have, again, the scripted, the network ports turn on and off at these hours a day, and you better hurry up and get your backups done during that time.
Right.
Because it's the only time it's going to be open to have their air gap. That usually gets pricey, too.
Yeah.
Changing a cloud is a lot cheaper compared to buying a bunch of specified hardware just for that.
Right. So that would be I'm using cloud as a target for my tiering of backups.
That's
right?
one way we can use it, yeah.
Okay. The other thing when I think of cloud is there's all these services that exist in the cloud today, and some of them have a native backup. So, for instance, if you're using Azure SQL or DynamoDB on AWS, it has a snapshot and backup feature kind of built in. But you could also use a third-party service to perform that backup. So, where do third-party backup and recovery solutions fit into backing up cloud-native type solutions or SaaS?
Well, it's a growing area still, because what's happening is people are finding that the cloud isn't necessarily always the cheapest place to go. Or they also need to, there's some places that still need to have that local backup copy. They have some regulatory need. There's always a few of them out there that still have those needs I need to have a local copy of that data. It can run in the cloud, but I got to know I have a local copy as well.
Right.
We have the ability to do RDS databases and VMs in AWS.
Okay.
And similar features are coming down the pike. Couldn't tell you exactly when, but for Azure as well.
Okay.
So ultimately what we want to be able to do is have those types of workloads, which are the most common ones, because then you get beyond that and you start to get into containerized services where really you should be able to drop those into VMware, Hyper-V, Azure, AWS, and have them all just about work the same on all those platforms because they're using the same tools.
Right.
So those are a little less of our concern. I'd say it's still something you want to be aware of, but it's not what we're looking at is that immediate backup, because we're talking data, not services.
Right.
Data exists in the VMs. Data exists in the databases. So if we have the ability to get those databases from point A to point B, suddenly we're getting to a point where it doesn't matter what platform you started on. You can go physical to virtual, physical to physical, physical to cloud, virtual to cloud to cloud even. Say you decide you want to see, hey, how does everything that I was running in AWS run in Azure? We can move those workloads as a backup and restore function from AWS to Azure and bring them online. The conversion of that VM is done as part of the process. Bring them online and test those application services in a totally different cloud.
That's an interesting use case. I like that. So if you are considering moving from one cloud provider to another and you want to see how your workloads do in that other environment, you could use the backup and recovery tool to do that in a test sort of way. I think that most people would be concerned about the egress charge. So if you're moving it out of AWS, wherever it's going, it's going to have to cross that boundary where you're getting charged an egress charge for the data.
But if you're already moving it for your backup, and then you also want to do that test, you're not paying twice for the egress because you've already moved that backup out in some way in all likelihood. It's not, You're not going to back up Azure to Azure necessarily, or AWS to AWS. You're going to want to get it back to on-prem possibly, or cloud to cloud, just as backup source and target to keep them different.
Right. I mean,
you can do that with regions, but some people want to go a little step further and make sure, like I highly doubt anybody still thinks that Azure is going to disappear overnight or AWS is going to disappear. I'll tell you what,
pretty safe bets.
If I get home and it says, sorry, Netflix no longer available because AWS disappeared,
we got bigger problems.
We got big problems.
It's crazy. But yeah, I hear you. If you're very paranoid about your backups and you really want them on a totally separate service, you may want to back up from AWS to Azure or AWS to on-prem or, whatever variation of that, but not AWS East US to West US.
Right.
Because then you're still staying within the same service. And if some amazing worm comes out that manages to corrupt all of S3,
even if it doesn't corrupt it, we've seen instances already for pick your cloud service where somebody fat fingers a router setting and certain pieces of a service aren't available for 6, 8, 10 hours. That's a full business day, and people who are using the cloud know how much that costs them.
Yes.
To be down for that time. So for them to be able to say, I can just make and again, they would have to plan for this ahead of time. I can make a few changes. I can run this restore, or I can be already running the restore and have those servers dormant in the other cloud and fire them up when I need them and go about my business. Maybe I'm down for an hour as opposed to 6, 8, 10, 12.
Right.
That's a huge benefit.
Yeah, and I could see a situation where a particular company has to keep their data within a certain geographic area. I know now that Brexit is kind of happening, there are some rules around UK-based companies having to keep sensitive data within the UK border.
Yes.
Now, if you want to do that and you're using AWS, you have a choice of one region.
Right.
So an alternative to that would be to back it up to Azure in their UK data center, and now you have two different services, two different data centers, but you're still staying all in on cloud.
Right, and you're seeing that. I mean, data sovereignty is something that's happening more and more. Canada requires it. Granted, they're larger countries, so you can go East Coast, West Coast, same as you can in the U.S. and cover a lot more ground. A little tiny place like the UK, different story. So you don't have a lot of choice. So you're going to see those sorts of requirements come up more and more. And it's one of those things like GDPR with right to be forgotten. Everything starts in that little corner of the earth there and then expands out from there. So that's there. And then for us, we see things happen in California, and then it sweeps across the country. And you're just going to start to see those requirements for data sovereignty. And maybe from a performance standpoint, you can't go to the West Coast, no matter what service you're on.
Yeah. So you got to keep it local. And if that's the case, you're going to need two targets.
Right. And some people, same goes if you're going from on-prem and you need to get out to the cloud. You have those as options as well, that you could do that recovery into the cloud if you're still an on-prem physical or virtual user.
Right, yeah. On backup and recovery software can often be used as a migration tool, especially if you don't need that real-time replication.
Absolutely. That's a great use for it as well, because it's a multi-use tool at that point. Because you can use it for that migration, and then a lot of times when you get migration tools, it's a one-use key. You have your 60 days or whatever to use it, and then you never use it again.
Right.
We were talking earlier about how people don't like to spend money on things that they don't want to use anyway. It's a perfect example. So now you can say, look, you're already buying this backup software. How about if you use it as your migration tool and your backup software? And that gets a lot of people interested in the process, and again, saving some money.
Yeah. I think also one of the native SaaS backups that I think Veeam supports is Office 365.
Yes.
Right?
It's one of our best-selling products. It was I just saw some recent stats that I believe this past year grew over 800%.
Wow.
Yes.
That's pretty tremendous.
Exactly.
Not, I think a lot of people don't realize that when you move into Exchange Online, Microsoft doesn't back that up.
No.
They don't back that up for you.
They do not. I've been to many of the Microsoft events where they stand on the stage and they proudly say, "We don't touch your data. We don't touch your data. That's your data. We don't do anything with it." And they say it in an excited way because you take it as, "Oh, good. That means they're not big brothering with our data and they're not going in there and investigating and looking at our data. Good." So it sounds like a celebratory thing.
Right.
But there should also be one time they say it where the lights get darker and it gets cloudy looking and they say, "And we don't touch your data. This is your last warning."
Right.
That includes backups, people.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have definitely had many client conversations where I bring that up and they have no idea.
Absolutely. It's amazing how, and I don't want to say blindly because I know a lot of people do a lot of research before they decide to move these services to Office 365. I'll use them as the example because that's the most common one.
Right.
I know the G Suite's out there, but folks just aren't hitting that. It's a nice for the academic world. I'll digress. Anyway, so it's amazing the work that they do, and they just don't think that that's going to be necessary. They feel like there's some magic second copy. Oh, Microsoft will take care of us. If it gets really bad, we'll call them up and they'll be able to restore it. First off, I want to know where this magic phone number for the backup hotline of Microsoft is that you're calling.
Yeah, I could use that.
Couldn't we all? Yeah.
And yeah, being able to recover your data from thin air would be even more amazing.
And
what a magic trick that is.
Thin air and down to an item level.
Yeah.
I deleted an email from yesterday. Microsoft's going to go, "Sorry to hear that. How'd you do it?" "Oh, I did the permanent delete." "I'm real sorry to hear that."
Yeah, that's gone.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously that's one component of it. Another component of 365 is, SharePoint Online and OneDrive. Is that something that's already part of Veeam's product, or is that something that's on the roadmap?
It is. So version 3 just came out at the beginning of this month for Veeam backup for Office 365. And so starting in version 2, we had Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive capabilities. And so I always think it's funny. Everybody always talks about the email capability, and we all know what that means. So you can restore down to the item level. You can use the same Explorer that we were talking about earlier for Exchange. It's the same interface that you restore from using Office 365 as well. So if you're used to Veeam, you're used to the Explorer that you need to restore. Even if you're not, it takes about all of 3 minutes to get comfortable with it.
Okay.
And then you still have all the same options for restore. Put it right back where you got it, save it out to a file, email it to somebody else within the organization. So same things you're already used to. So, but for OneDrive, that's an interesting one, especially if you only have like a standard E3 license for Microsoft, and that's the one that typically every business has. For those that aren't familiar, it's the middle of the road one. It has all the features everybody's used to and none of the additional bells and whistles. They come in the E5, which goes for about $20 a month per user more, something like that.
Yeah, E5 is a big step.
Yes. Yeah, so it's almost double what that one costs. And it adds a lot of features, and some of those features have to do with archiving and the ability to hold on to that data for longer term. Right. So most people don't have that because it's a significant upgrade just for those features. If you have that, do you have, what is it, typically 30 to 90 days is the typical window where Microsoft will hold on to a copy of something depending on how you have things set. Right. So that's all you have. We were talking earlier about that 140 days for ransomware from actual insertion into your network to actual detection. Right. So you're outside of that window for most of those things. So if you have a problem, you may not be able to get back behind where you started to have the problem. But what I like for the OneDrive is the simple thing. Anybody that's using it and is in a management position has gotten that email when their employee leaves. You've been granted access to so-and-so's OneDrive. You have 30 days to decide what to do with the data, and then it will be permanently deleted. Yep. Well, typically what happens is whatever the hot project is at that moment, those files get moved over to whoever's taking it over. And then maybe you have one of two other things that happen. The rest of the stuff, the manager might take all the stuff and dump into their OneDrive, or just delete it because they don't feel like dealing with it, or they forget about it. And let's face it, people are busy. Right. You take care of what's hot on your plate right now, and getting that one project going was it. You get back to it 2 months ago. Oh, now what do I do?
Right.
Or you never think of it again because now that email is 10,000 deep in your mailbox.
Mm-hmm.
So a year from now, somebody comes and says, I know so-and-so who left last year was working on this project. Do you have any, where can we find some files? Or you call the help desk and ask to have them back, restored from backup. They go, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't back that up. The manager, if you even know who the manager is, if that manager hasn't moved on and now the problem's been kicked down the lane yet another level,
right.
Maybe they can help you. Maybe you don't even know to go to that person. But the bottom line is there's no way for you as the person who's taking on that job to ever search for that data again. If you have it backed up into a product like Veeam Backup for Office 365, now it's completely searchable. So it's indexed so that now you can go through and pick out by file name. So if you know it's Project XYZ, you search on Project XYZ, and you can do that across multiple OneDrives, right, and have all that data brought up and restored back to a place that makes sense for you. Same goes in SharePoint. Now the cool thing is the hot product of Microsoft now is Teams.
Yep.
There's no Teams backup because Teams is kind of a nice shell around multiple products. People don't necessarily know that, but one of the things that Microsoft did, and Teams was kind of born out of this, they started making these cool little products that would encourage consumption of the core Microsoft products. Exchange, Skype for Business at the time, SharePoint, all into one. Teams encompasses all of those.
Right.
So you use Teams, now you're using pieces of all these products. That helps Microsoft overall. And it really is a great way. People kind of had to be shown how to use these products. They knew they were great, but they don't really know SharePoint. What do I do with it? Well, you develop now. I'm an IT department. I'm not developing. Right. Hard pass. On to the next thing. Yeah. So now you have Teams. Now all of a sudden you're using it. You have nice thing about that is you don't know you're using it. The bad part of that is if you don't know you're using it, you may not be backing it up.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
If we can back up all the SharePoint components that are used in Teams, and we can, through the fact that when you do chat, you can have those conversation histories saved into your Exchange the same way that you can for Skype for Business. Mm-hmm. They get backed up that way. So now you still have that history if that's a requirement to keep for your business. Mm-hmm. Now you have the ability to go back and restore what the important things are out of that, the communication and the data.
Right.
Now, if something happens and you lose kind of the group itself, you may have to recreate the group, and then you can attach the repositories and all that sort of stuff back into it. But you have the ability to do that. So you're not going to find a product that says backup for Teams, or if it is, it's probably just combining these things under the covers. So we have the ability to do that because we back up the main components that are used in Teams.
Okay. Very cool. All right. Well, as we're starting to wrap up, I think we kind of talked a little bit about here, and I just want to revisit some of the value adds that we talked about. Like, yes, you get the baseline backup and recovery with the solution, but you really want to see, is it adding value by creating new opportunities with dev and test? Is it enabling me to also put coverage in my cloud or export that stuff somewhere else? And is it providing the opportunity to do some sort of advanced analytics? And so if your solution isn't doing any of those things, then it's time to see a different solution.
Maybe time to revisit.
Those are some big opportunities to make backup and recovery software more than just an insurance policy.
Definitely.
So, Eric, if people want to know more about you, how can they get in touch with you? Where should they look?
So they can look for me specifically. I'm available on LinkedIn.
Okay.
I don't know the whole URL, but if you look for Eric Doherty on LinkedIn, you'll see my handsome face, and which you don't see today because we're on a podcast. But you'll see my face, and you'll see, obviously, that I am a technical partner manager with Veeam. Mm-hmm. There's a few Eric Dohertys out there, but I think I come up pretty high in the list.
Okay. I'll include a link in the show notes as well.
Great. I'm on Twitter as well as at Eric S. Doherty.
Okay. Excellent. Is that the best ways to reach out is through Twitter or?
Yeah, Twitter, LinkedIn are the two that I'm visiting the most, I'd say, for work.
No Snap or Instagram?
No. Don't get me started on Instagram. I'm a photographer, and I have my issues with Instagram. So
okay.
That's another
hot
podcast.
Button issue.
That's another podcast. We'll go down doing one on that later.
Awesome. Well, Eric Doherty, thanks so much for being on the Anexipod.
My pleasure.
And that was our show with Eric Doherty. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Anexinet for helping produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your complete digital experience, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet, see how we can help. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anexapod, why not leave a nice review on iTunes? If you're looking for more content, you can check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-hosts to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can find out more about me and what I'm up to on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you can miss it.